In this lesson, we're going to look at how to work with the data types that we've been talking about in the previous lesson by creating data and storing it in a variable, which is where data has to reside if we're going to work with it in a program in any meaningful way. So to create a variable, you have to do two things. You have to declare the data type for the variable. So here's an example of an int, and then a variable name. So here is what we call a variable, declaration. We're declaring number to be a variable of int type. Let's look at another example. String name. So now we're saying that name is going to be a variable of string type. Also, while I'm thinking of it, when you're working with strings in C++, you need to pound include the string library to make sure that you can work with strings correctly. So always pound include string when you're going to work with string values. Let's look at another example, double pi. If we're going to store pi as a variable, char letter to create a char variable to store a single letter, and then finally bool flag to store a Boolean value. So those are all examples of variable declarations. The other thing we will often do is not only declare a variable, but initialize it with a value. So for example, int salary, oops, having trouble typing there. So this is what we call a variable initialization, where we not only declare the variable salary to be of int type, but we also provide a value for that. Here's another example, string first name equals Jane. Here we're saying that we have a variable called first name and we want to initialize it with the value Jane. Let me redo pi again, just because I like to use it as an example. I'm going to comment out the other one. There's pi. Here's a letter, and then here we're initializing a Boolean variable choice to be false. So those are examples of variable declarations, these first few, and then what we call variable declaration and initialization, or just initialization, where we not only declare the variable but also assign it a value. And notice that we're using the equal sign, I need to talk about that also, as what we call the assignment operator. So don't think that when I write int salary equals 35,000, that says 350,000. That I'm declaring some sort of equality. That's really not what we're doing here. What we're doing here is we're saying take the literal int value 35,000 and assign it to the int variable salary. That's what we're doing right there. There's another way to express equality, and we'll look at that later in the course. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here are examples of what are legal and illegal variable names. Notice that I tend to always make my variables one-word names unless I want to make it a two-word name. And if I do that, then I use what's called camel casing, where I make the first word lowercase and then I capitalize the first letter of the second word. Another way to write that same variable would be to use an underscore, and that's another common way to do it. To create a two-word variable name is to use an underscore. What you can't do is you can't put a space. If I tried to run this program, I'll get an error saying that it didn't recognize what I was trying to do there. So you can't use a space. I tend to use camel casing more than underscores, just because it's easier to do that. Let me run this to get rid of the error message there. Now everything should work. There's nothing processed, so you don't see any output, but there we go. A couple other things you can't do. You can't start a variable with a symbol. And actually you can't have a symbol anywhere in a variable name. So I can't do $num and I can't do num $sign. Again, I should get an error when I try to compile that. Oh, no, it liked it at the end. It just doesn't like it at the beginning. So let's redo that. Oops, sorry, I have a semicolon. Let's try it again. Nope. Sometimes it will let you do that. So symbols are sometimes okay. It's really not a good style to use a symbol, but obviously you can if you want to. The most important thing is you need to start it with a letter and you need to not have spaces. And the last thing I'm going to say is that your variables need to be mnemonic. In other words, they need to sort of indicate what it is they're storing. So int number is perfectly good. String name is fine. But if I wrote something like int xyz, well, that's not telling me anything. It's legal, but it's not mnemonic, so you don't need to use it. The compiler will let you, but it's primarily a mistake. So always make your variables names indicate in some way what kind of value is being stored in that variable. And then you won't have problems with people reading your programs and not understanding what your variables are, or even better, you looking at a program after a length of time and not understanding what that variable's meaning is because the name doesn't make any sense. So that wraps up this lesson on variable declaration and initialization, and also on illegal, and good variable naming practices.